I was thinking about this the other day. When we look up like a towering skyscraper, there is this fundamental assumption we all make, right? Without even really thinking about it.
Oh, sure. Like, we just assume it didn't magically appear.
Right. We look at the sheer glass walls,
Hmm.
the steel girders, the sweeping architectural lines, and we know with absolute certainty that before a single shovel hit the dirt to dig the foundation, there was a blueprint.
Yeah, I mean, it's just an intuitive way we process the world around us. An architect had a vision, mathematically mapped it out, and the physical building you are staring at is really just the material manifestation of that pre-existing idea.
Exactly.
And we find that comforting, It implies that order precedes chaos.
Right. But imagine, though, if someone came along, tapped you on the shoulder and said, actually, you're wrong. There was never a blueprint.
Wow.
Yeah, like what happened was we just had a bunch of raw steel and glass shards and concrete blowing around in an incredibly violent tornado for, I don't know, millions of years. And through a series of completely random blind collisions, the weak structures collapsed, while the slightly more stable ones accidentally stayed up. And eventually, after enough time, boom, you get the Empire State Building.
I mean, applied to architecture, that sounds statistically ludicrous.
Wholly absurd.
But when you apply that exact same logic to biology, right? To the staggering complexity of the human eye or the intricate folding of a protein or the mind-bending data storage capacity of a DNA molecule, that is precisely the conceptual tension that just ripped through the intellectual world in the 19th century.
And that tension is exactly what we're exploring today on the Deep Dive.
Yes.
Our mission today is to unpack a really fascinating historical and philosophical crossroads, which is detailed in a highly researched book called Evolution and Baha'I Belief. It's by Kevin Brown and Eberhard von Kitzing.
It's a dense one, but so good.
Oh, yeah. We are going to look at how a major religious figure from the East engaged with the West's most disruptive scientific theory. And, spoiler alert, he didn't do it by simply rejecting the science of evolution. Instead, he completely redefined the philosophical architecture operating beneath it.
Right. We're basically looking at a brilliant, somewhat forgotten intersection of classical philosophy, evolutionary biology, and theology.
Which is a wild mix.
It really is. And before we get into the weeds here, we do need to make something very clear to you, the listener, because we are going to be discussing highly charged themes today, atheism, materialism, intelligent design, scriptural interpretation, all those messy cultural clashes between science and religion.
Yeah, the big ones.
So we want to state unequivocally that we are not endorsing the religious or the scientific viewpoints of the content we are covering. We certainly aren't taking sides in modern political or theological debates. Our role is strictly to act as impartial guides, helping you navigate and understand the ideas contained within this original source material.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I think to truly appreciate the response coming from the Middle East, we really have to start by understanding the sheer scale of the intellectual earthquake Charles Darwin caused in the West.
Back in 1859.
Right, on the origin of species. We really need to look at the world before Darwin to see exactly what he broke.
Well, the pre-Darwinian worldview in Europe was incredibly stable, and that stability largely stemmed from the fact that religion and science were, for the most part, essentially on the exact same page.
Which is hard for us to imagine today.
Totally. The reigning scientific paradigm in biology at the time was something called typological thinking, which is also known as essentialism. You had these brilliant leading scientists of the day, figures like Georges Cuvier and Louis Agassiz,
Right.
and they firmly championed the belief that all species on Earth were created independently by God.
Let me make sure I understand this typological thinking. Does that mean they viewed every animal as a specific type or prototype that couldn't be altered?
That's a really good way to frame it, actually. The core premise was that species were completely fixed and entirely discontinuous from one another.
Okay.
In their view, a dog was a dog and a cat was a cat because a divine creator had fashioned the immutable essence of a dog and the essence of a cat. Now, I mean, they weren't blind. They obviously saw that dogs came in different shapes and sizes.
Sure, a Great Dane versus a Chihuahua.
Exactly. But they believed any variations, say a wolf being slightly larger or a fox having different colored fur, were just accidental environmental deviations from that fixed central perfect essence.
So in their minds, you might have variations on a theme, but you could never, ever cross the boundary from one theme to another. Like a fish couldn't become an amphibian.
Never.
Yeah.
The boundaries between species were considered impenetrable walls built by God, and this biological perspective fit perfectly into a much broader philosophical framework known as the Great Chain of Being.
Ah, I've heard that phrase before. Mostly in literature classes, though. What did it actually mean for a 19th century scientist?
So, the Great Chain of Being was this deeply entrenched, static, conceptual linkage of all existence. Picture a massive vertical ladder.
Okay, ladder.
At the very bottom, you have the lowest, most basic minerals and rocks. Move up a rung, you get simple plants, then more complex trees. Above that, the lower animals, then the higher mammals, eventually reaching humanity.
And it keeps going up.
Above humanity, you had the angels, and finally, at the very top, God. It was a beautiful, ordered hierarchy, but the key word there is static. Nothing evolved from one rung to the next. The chain was forged once, in the beginning, and remained forever unchanged.
And then Charles Darwin walks into the room and essentially takes a sledgehammer to this beautiful static ladder. From what I understand in the source material, Darwin introduces a concept that biologists now call population thinking, which, I mean, it completely flips essentialism on its head.
Oh, it does way more than flip it. It basically annihilates the premise. Darwin looked at this essentialist idea that species are fixed, eternal realities of nature, and argued that it was an illusion.
An illusion?
Yeah. He proposed that a species is merely a nominal construct. It's just a label, an arbitrary category that we human beings invented for our own mental convenience, just to group together individuals that happen to look similar at a given point in time.
Wow, that feels like a massive paradigm shift. He's saying there is no essence of a dog floating around in the universe.
That is the crux of population thinking. Darwin argued that the only thing that is actually objectively real in nature is the individual organism and the population of those unique individuals. The average or the type is just an abstraction. The variation is the reality.
Right, and the mechanism he proposed for how these populations changed over time is what we all learned in high school biology, right?
Exactly.
First, you have these accidental, seemingly random variations occurring within individual organisms when they reproduce. And second, you have natural selection acting upon those variations based on whatever environmental pressure the organism is facing.
Yes, exactly. If a random variation, say a slightly thicker coat of fur or a slightly sharper beak, if that happens to help an organism survive in a changing environment, it lives long enough to pass that specific trait on to its offspring.
And if it doesn't help?
If the variation is detrimental, the organism dies out before reproducing.
Yeah.
And over vast, just unfathomable stretches of geological time, these tiny, incremental, accidental changes accumulate until the population looks completely different from its ancestors.
And Darwin didn't just propose this as a neat philosophical idea, did he? I mean, he brought a mountain of empirical evidence that made his theory incredibly difficult to ignore. The source text mentions several pillars of his argument. Let's walk through those. Vestigial organs is a big one.
Vestigial organs were a huge piece of the puzzle. Darwin pointed to things like the seemingly useless pelvic bones hidden deep inside the bodies of whales or the human appendix.
Right.
Under the old model of special creation, this made zero sense. Why would a perfect creator design a whale with useless leg bones?
It's like putting an ashtray on a motorcycle.
Exactly. But under Darwin's model, it made perfect sense. Whales descended from land-dwelling mammals, and those bones are evolutionary leftovers, slowly disappearing because they're no longer selected for.
He also relied heavily on geographical distribution, right? Like the famous finches on the Galapagos Islands.
The geographical evidence was arguably his strongest card. I mean, if God independently created every species to perfectly fit its environment, why were the animals on isolated islands so similar to the animals on the nearest mainland, yet slightly different?
Right, like they didn't just pop into existence out of nowhere.
Exactly. Darwin observed that the finches on the Galapagos were clearly related to South American finches, but their beaks had adapted differently on each island depending on whether they needed to crack hard nuts or catch insects.
And the same logic applied to the unique marsupials in Australia, right?
Yes. It only made sense if a common ancestor arrived there and then slowly evolved in isolation, rather than being uniquely beamed down onto the continent by a creator.
The sources also noted he used taxonomy, showing how species naturally branch in a tree-like structure rather than a straight ladder, and embryology, noting how the early embryonic stages of entirely different species, like a human, a pig, and a chicken, look remarkably, almost indistinguishably similar.
Yes, they do.
But looking at the historical reaction, it seems like the empirical evidence itself wasn't really what caused the existential meltdown of Victorian society. The crisis was rooted in the philosophical implications of what those finches and embryos meant.
That touches on the absolute deepest nerve of the Darwinian revolution. What Darwin fundamentally did was remove teleology from the natural world.
Okay, let's pause there. Teleology, that's a heavy word. We need to define that clearly for the listener.
Sure. Teleology is the philosophical concept of goal-directedness. It's the idea that things in nature happen for a specific purpose or are moving toward a predetermined endpoint.
So having a destination in mind.
Right. Before Darwin, even some of the earlier evolutionary theorists had a teleological view. Think of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who proposed an evolutionary theory decades before Darwin. Lamarck believed that life was imbued with an internal striving, a mysterious vital force that was actively pushing organisms up the ladder toward perfection and complexity.
So even in earlier models of evolution, there was a finish line in mind.
Yes, there was a direction, but Darwin introduced a universe that was profoundly different. He proposed a world where complex order, like the staggering, miraculous, interlocking structure of the human eye, arises entirely from blind, mindless algorithms.
Wow.
In a strictly Darwinian universe, there is no pre-existing purpose, there is no goal, there is no blueprint, there is only chance variation and the ruthless necessity of survival. Nature is basically throwing spaghetti at the wall for 1 billion years to see what sticks.
Which brings me right back to my tornado in the skyscraper analogy. I mean, if Darwin's theory is essentially claiming that a monkey randomly hammering away at a typewriter will eventually produce the complete works of Shakespeare, simply because a mechanism exists to throw away the misspelled pages and keep the good ones, how on earth did the trained scientific minds of the 19th century accept that?
Well,
Because to someone steeped in classical logic, relying entirely on random chance to build functional complexity sounds statistically absurd.
yeah, and the reality of the history, which often gets glossed over today, is that many of the top scientists of the time flat out didn't accept it.
Wait, really?
Oh, yeah. We suffer from this historical amnesia where we imagine Darwin published Origin of Species and all the enlightened scientists immediately stood up and applauded, while only the religious fundamentalists protested. That simply isn't true.
Interesting.
Some of the most prominent scientists of the era figures, like the astronomer John Herschel, the paleontologist Richard Owen, and the zoologist Francois Pictet, pushed back against Darwin with incredible ferocity.
What were their scientific grounds for rejecting it, though? Were they just clinging to their Bibles?
Not at all. Their objections were highly technical. First, they pointed to the glaring lack of intermediate transitional fossils. Darwin's theory required species to gradually morph into one another over millions of generations. If that were true, the geological strata should be absolutely bursting with halfway creatures.
Like half fish, half lizard kind of thing.
Right. You should find a smooth, continuous gradient of fossils. But paleontologists at the time were seeing the exact opposite. They saw species appear suddenly in the fossil record, remain mostly morphologically static for millions of years, and then go extinct.
And what about the mechanics of natural selection itself? Did they buy the idea that blind chance could build something like a wing?
That was their second major point of attack. The statistical impossibility of blind chance building complex organs before those organs offer any survival advantage. Francois Pictet articulated this brilliantly. He argued that a fully formed wing is obviously beneficial for a bird, right?
Sure.
But a wing doesn't evolve overnight. According to Darwin, it must evolve through thousands of tiny random variations. So Pictet asked, what good is a 5% formed wing?
Oh, that's a good point.
It's utterly useless for flying. In fact, a clumsy half-formed nub on a creature's back might actually be a detriment, making it slower or clumsier.
So natural selection would actually select against the half wing, weeding it out before it ever got the chance to become a full wing.
Precisely the argument. How could natural selection, which has no foresight and only cares about immediate survival, select a useless half-wing over thousands of generations before it finally crosses the threshold into having survival value?
Right.
Scientists like Pictet and Herschel argued that unguided chance simply couldn't achieve this. They maintained that an underlying intelligence guided by a teleological purpose must be directing these biological changes.
Okay, so that sets the stage for this massive shockwave echoing across Europe. The scientific community is fractured. But as we know, disruptive ideas don't respect borders. Darwin's theories eventually made their way out of Europe and traveled to the Middle East, into the Arab world.
They did.
And according to the source material, the reaction there ignited a completely different kind of firestorm. If I'm reading this right, it seems like the thinkers in the Middle East were far less obsessed with the specific biology of finch beaks and much more alarmed by what this theory meant for the fate of human society.
That is a crucial distinction. When we shift our focus to the Arab world in the late 19th century, we are looking at a society in the midst of a profound intellectual ferment. They were grappling with rapid modernization, imperialism, and a massive influx of Western ideas.
A lot of upheaval.
Exactly. And a major vehicle for transmitting these ideas was an incredibly influential Arab science journal called Al-Muqattaf. It was founded in Beirut in 1876 by two Christian Arabs, Yaqub Saruf and Faris Nifter.
So how did a journal like Al-Muqattaf handle a radioactive topic like Darwinism? Did they just translate his work verbatim and publish it?
Oh no, they were far more cautious than that. They recognized the explosive nature of the material. They initially introduced Darwin's concepts through a contributing writer named Rizqallah al-Barbari, who attempted a very delicate tightrope walk.
How so?
Barbari, and later the editors Saruf and Nimr themselves, acknowledged that the physical, scientific evidence for evolution was compelling. But they desperately tried to strip away the atheistic, mindless, purely random implications that European materialists were attaching to it.
They were trying to sanitize it, in a way.
You could say that. They argued that evolution might simply be the mechanical method that God used to create the diversity of life. Sarif wrote fascinating articles trying to bridge the gap. He suggested that just as classical Islamic philosophers believed simple, base metals like lead possessed an internal drive to gradually perfect themselves into gold over time, perhaps biological species also possessed an internal divine drive to gradually progress toward higher forms.
Okay, I see what they're doing. They are trying to save the blueprint.
Yes.
They are saying, yes, the building evolved over time. It wasn't just poofed into existence in 6 literal days, but God is still the architect drawing the plans.
That was the goal. But historically, you rarely get to open Pandora's box and control which ideas fly out. Their attempt at a moderate, guided evolution was soon overshadowed by much more radical voices. Enter a figure named Shibli Shumail.
Who was he?
Shumail was a Lebanese thinker, and he was arguably the first to bring militant, European-style materialism into the Arab intellectual sphere. He translated the works of Ludwig Buchner, who was a fiercely atheistic German philosopher, into Arabic.
Oh, wow.
And Shumail essentially weaponized Darwinism. He wasn't interested in the nuances of biology. He used evolutionary theory as a blunt instrument to claim that humanity and the universe are purely mechanical phenomena.
Meaning what, exactly? That we are just biological machines?
He argued that human beings differ from rocks and minerals only in quantity and complexity, not in essence. He used Darwin to forcefully promote the idea that there is no spiritual reality whatsoever. There is no divine plan, there is no soul, there is no afterlife. There is only matter operating under the blind laws of physics and motion.
Given the deeply religious context of the Middle East at that time, I have to imagine that did not go over well with the established Islamic thinkers.
It provoked an absolute intellectual counteroffensive. You had towering figures of Islamic reform like Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, who wrote a blistering, highly influential refutation of the materialists.
What do you say?
Well, al-Afghani didn't mince words. He absolutely mocked the idea that what he called blind necessity could act as a wise guide to create complex organs. He posed a rhetorical question: how could scattered, unintelligent germs essentially hold a parliament, debate among themselves, and consciously decide to form themselves into the elegant aerodynamic structure of a bird?
Huh. He's hitting on that exact same statistical improbability that the European scientists like Dictet were pointing out regarding the half-formed wing.
Right. The underlying logic of the objection was identical, even if the cultural context was different. Then you had other thinkers, like Hussein al-Juzr, who took a more surgical approach. Instead of just rejecting it outright, al-Juzr looked closely at Darwin's proposed mechanisms.
Yeah.
He said, I can observe the natural world. I can accept that there is a struggle to survive. I can accept the observable fact that offspring inherit traits from their parents. But where he drew a hard line was the idea that random variation could mutate one distinct essence, one species, into a completely different essence.
That brings us to another figure mentioned in the source material, a Shiite theologian named Abu Umayyad al-Isfahani, writing a bit later, around 1914. From my understanding, Isfahani didn't just attack the broad philosophy. He actually rolled up his sleeves and went after Darwin's specific technical biological proofs.
Isfahani's critique is arguably one of the most sophisticated from that era. What's fascinating is that he didn't attack Darwin personally. In fact, He praised Darwin's scientific rigor, and he deliberately quoted Darwin's own admissions about the hypothetical nature of some of his conclusions.
So who was his target?
Isfahani's target was the materialists who had hijacked the theory and proclaimed it as absolute dogma.
So how did he dismantle their arguments?
Right.
Let's take embryology. The Darwinists argued that because a human embryo goes through stages where it looks like a fish and then a reptile, it proves we evolved from them.
Right. The famous phrase coined by Ernst Haeckel was ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, meaning the development of the embryo replays the evolutionary history of the species. Isfahani looked at this and pointed out that it was nowhere near as clean or universal as the materialists claimed.
What did he find?
He noted that in several species, embryos completely skip developmental stages that they supposedly should go through if they were strictly replaying their evolutionary past. If the rule isn't universal, he argued, it can't be used as an ironclad proof of descent.
Interesting. What about the vestigial organs argument? Because Darwin leaned heavily on the idea of organs that don't do anything anymore, like the whale's pelvis.
Isfahani offered a brilliant counter to this, rooted in the limits of human knowledge. He argued that just because we don't know an organ's function now doesn't mean it never had one, or, more importantly, that it won't have one in the future.
Wait, an organ developing a function in the future?
Yes. To illustrate this, Isfahani used the analogy of human puberty. He pointed to a young girl's breasts, which remain undeveloped and entirely non-functional for years. If you only studied a child, you might conclude those tissues were useless or vestigial, but at maturity, they suddenly fulfill a vital function.
Wow, okay.
Isfahani argued that on a massive evolutionary timescale, certain organs might develop over epochs, appearing useless for millions of years before the organism reaches a state of maturity where the ultimate function of that organ is realized.
That is a wild way to look at geological time. What about homology, though? The similarity of bone structures, the idea that a bat's wing, a whale's flipper, and a human hand all have the same basic arrangement of bones, therefore they must share a physical, biological ancestor.
Well, Isfahani pointed out a fundamental logical flaw in assuming that structural similarity demands physical descent.
Let me see if I can build an analogy for this. Say I go to a factory and look at a sedan and a heavy-duty pickup truck. They both have four wheels, a steering column, an engine block, and the exact same type of nuts and bolts holding the chassis together.
Right.
If I use Darwinian logic on homology, I would have to conclude that the sedan biologically reproduced, underwent some mutations, and eventually gave birth to the pickup truck. But obviously that's absurd. The shared structure doesn't mean one gave birth to the other. It just means the same engineers used a common, effective design blueprint for both vehicles. Is that basically what Isfahani was arguing?
You've captured the exact essence of his argument. Isfahani argued that homologous biological structures don't necessarily prove physical biological descent through a common ancestor. They can just as easily and logically be interpreted as evidence of a similar design blueprint utilized by a single creator.
So it's about functional utility.
Yes. The similarity exists by conscious design for functional utility, not by blind physical inheritance.
So if we step back and look at the board, the intellectual world is in absolute chaos. We have the West reeling from the loss of teleology and fighting over missing links. We have the Arab world battling over the soul of humanity, terrified of the social implications of materialism. And right into the center of this explosive, completely polarized debate steps our focal figure, Abdu'L-Baha.
Yes, Abdu'L-Baha, who is the son of the founder of the Baha'I faith, travels extensively through Europe and North America between 1911 and 1913. And as he engages with scientists, philosophers, and religious leaders, he does something intellectually remarkable.
What does he do?
He absolutely refuses to take the side of the militant materialist scientists, but he equally refuses to retreat into the camp of the fundamentalist theologians.
The source material highlights this concept he frequently taught, called the two wings. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah. The Baha'i teachings place a heavy emphasis on the principle that science and religion are not adversaries, but rather two wings of one bird. For humanity to fly, for human civilization to progress and elevate itself, both wings must be equally developed and in perfect coordination.
So what happens if a society only develops one wing?
Abdu'L-Baha argued that religion without the moderating influence of science quickly devolves into blind superstition, dogma, and fanaticism. Conversely, science completely stripped of the moral and spiritual grounding of religion devolves into a cold, amoral materialism that treats human beings as disposable commodities.
That makes a lot of sense.
Because truth is universally one, he argued that true science and true religion can never fundamentally contradict each other. In fact, he went so far as to state that if a specific religious belief categorically contradicts proven scientific fact, that belief is merely ignorance and superstition and should be discarded.
But if he is that pro-science, how does he handle the Darwin debate? Because here is where I think this entire topic gets incredibly fascinating and honestly a bit confusing at first glance.
It can be, yeah.
The entire debate between Abdu'L-Baha and the Darwinists seems to hinge on a massive linguistic and philosophical misunderstanding of a single word. When he talks about a species evolving or not evolving, using the Arabic words mahiyya or noiyya, he is absolutely not using the modern biological definition of that word.
You've hit on the crux of the entire issue, and this is exactly where readers of the text often get tangled up. Today, if you say the word species to a trained biologist, they immediately think of a reproductively isolated population.
Right. Like if a specific group of finches can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, they are a species. If a mutation prevents them from interbreeding with other finches, they have become a new, separate species. It is a strictly physical, biological, and temporal categorization.
Exactly. It's about DNA and mating. But when Abdu'L-Baha uses the term mahiyya essence or Nalia species, he is operating in the classical Platonic sense of the word. He is not talking about a physical population of breeding birds. He is talking about a species essence.
A species essence. Let me try to wrap my head around this. So it's not the physical feathers and bones of the bird, but the invisible law or idea that makes a bird a bird.
Yes. Think of it as an abstract, timeless reality or a natural law that dictates the absolute limits and potential of a physical organism. To use a physics analogy, gravity doesn't have a physical body. You can't put gravity in a jar, but gravity is an invisible law that perfectly dictates how physical bodies must behave and move in the universe.
I like that analogy.
So, in this philosophical view, a species' essence is a metaphysical blueprint. It exists independently of the physical material, but it dictates how that material can organize itself.
Okay, to truly grasp this concept of the originality of species, as Abdu'L-Baha called it, we have to open up the philosophical toolbox he was using. The text notes he frequently referred to the philosophers of the East. We are talking about a lineage of thought that stretches all the way back to ancient Greece, but was heavily expanded, modified, and upgraded by centuries of Islamic thinkers.
We have to start with the foundational Greeks, primarily Aristotle and Plato, because they set the terms of the debate. Aristotle essentially believed that species are just mental constructs. We observe physical dogs, we notice their shared traits, and our minds derive the concept of a dog.
Right, it's just a category we made up.
For Aristotle, the universe is eternal, static, and fundamentally unchanging. The immanent substance of a dog is just, well, in the dog.
And Plato.
Plato took a much more mystical approach. He believed in a transcendent creator, and he posited that this creator uses pre-existing, perfect, internal forms or essences to shape chaotic physical matter. The physical world is just a shadow of these perfect invisible forms.
The eternal blueprint.
Yes. Now, the Islamic philosophers translated these Greek texts, but they didn't just copy them. They massively expanded the architecture. Thinkers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna introduced a vital concept called emanation.
What's that?
They argued that creation isn't a one-time event, it's a continuous outpouring from God. They posited that simple, base elements in the physical world mix, combine, and interact over time. And as these physical elements reach a certain necessary level of complex preparation, the ground is finally laid for higher, more complex spiritual forms, these pre-existing essences, to suddenly manifest in the physical world.
I think I need an analogy for emanation. It sounds almost like upgrading a computer's hardware.
Exactly.
They have an advanced operating system, the essence, the software. They can't run on an old 1990s motherboard. The hardware, the physical elements, has to be gradually upgraded, mixed, and improved over time until it reaches a threshold of complexity where it can finally cache and run the advanced software. The software existed all along, but the physical hardware had to catch up.
That is a remarkably useful modern translation of Avicenna's concept. It requires both the preparation of the material and the pre-existence of the form. But the philosophy doesn't stop there. The text introduces a 16th century Persian philosopher named Mulla Sadra, who brings a truly revolutionary concept to the table called substantial motion.
Why was that revolutionary?
Because for nearly 2,000 years, Aristotelian thinkers believed that the underlying substance of a thing never changes, only its superficial accidents, like a green leaf turning brown. The leaf substance is the same, only its color changed.
Right.
Sadr completely broke this mold. He argued that the physical universe is not static at all. It is in a constant, relentless, agonizing state of becoming, development, and evolutionary motion from within its very core.
He's proposing a universe that is fundamentally dynamic, centuries before Darwin. And then, according to the outline, this is refined even further by Sheikh Ahmad in the 18th century, who introduces the idea of horizontal versus vertical becoming.
Sheikh Ahmad's contribution is critical for understanding Abdu'L-Baha's biological views. Ahmad posited that things certainly evolve, they unfold, they grow, they change horizontally in the physical world of time, space, and matter. But they only do so as they are guided by their vertical spiritual essence, which exists outside of time and space. The horizontal motion is entirely dependent on the vertical tether.
Okay, I have been chewing on this horizontal versus vertical concept, and I think I have a way to visualize it. Bear with me, this goes back to video games. Let's say I buy a copy of a massive role-playing game. The software code, which represents the vertical essence, is burned onto a disk.
Okay, I follow you so far.
That code is fixed, it's perfect, it exists timelessly, and it contains the absolute entirety of the game's universe, its rules, and its potential. But the game itself doesn't actually happen until I put the disk in the console and press play, entering the physical world of time.
Yes.
When I press play, the character starts at level 1 with nothing. As I play over hours and weeks, the character gains experience, unlocks abilities, finds new armor, and progresses horizontally across the screen and through time. The character is constantly changing, adapting, and in a sense, evolving.
Right.
But here is the catch. No matter how many thousands of hours I play that fantasy RPG, the code sets absolute limits. My wizard character will never ever horizontally evolve into a race car from a driving game, because the vertical code on the disk dictates the uncrossable boundaries of what that game can become.
While it's a very modern metaphor, the mechanics of your analogy align almost perfectly with Sheikh Ahmad's philosophy. The physical manifestation, the gameplay evolves and changes, but it never transmutates into a fundamentally different essence, a different game entirely. The eternal blueprint dictates the parameters of the physical evolution.
So if we take this deep, ancient, dynamic philosophy of essences and substantial motion, and we crash it into the explosion of 19th century Darwinian science, how does Abdu'L-Baha specifically synthesize the two? How does he answer Darwin?
He does it through a highly nuanced position. He accepts the observable reality of evolution while fiercely rejecting the unguided mechanism of Darwinian transmutation. We have to be crystal clear on what Abdu'L-Baha is accepting.
Yeah.
He completely embraces the geological reality that the Earth is incredibly old. He leaves no room for a literal 6,000-year creation timeline based on a strict reading of Genesis. He fully accepts that life on Earth started as simple, primitive organisms and evolved over millions of eons into the complex animals and humans we see today.
To use the analogy, he fully accepts the horizontal gameplay. He acknowledges that biological forms have changed drastically over time.
Yes, but where he draws an immovable line is against Darwinian transmutation. The specific materialist claim that environmental pressure and blind, random chance alone can slowly turn a primitive dog-like creature into a whale, or a branch of ancient primates into human beings.
Because that would mean the game could become a racing game.
Exactly. Because to accept that is to imply that the software code of the universe is writing itself randomly as it goes along with no master programmer and no end goal.
And to counter the idea of a blind universe, the source material notes that he uses a philosophical argument about the perfection of the cosmos. He says the universe is a perfect, harmonious system designed specifically to reflect the attributes of its creator.
Correct. The argument posits that humanity is unique because it is the specific being within the physical universe capable of reflecting all of the creator's attributes, things like abstract consciousness, love, justice, mercy, and scientific intellect.
Right.
Abdu'L-Baha argues that if man didn't exist, the universe would be, in his words, a tree without fruit. It would be a massive, complex machine with no purpose. Therefore, because the universe is purposeful, the potential, the blueprint, the essence of humanity must have eternally existed in the mind of God.
So humanity wasn't just a lucky lottery ticket that happened to wander onto the evolutionary stage after 1 billion years of random mutations. The stage itself was built specifically for the play.
Exactly. And to explain how this eternal essence interacts with physical biology, Abdu'L-Baha uses his most famous and perhaps most heavily debated scientific analogy. He says that the evolution of the species resembles the development of the embryo. In biological terms, ontogeny resembles phylogeny.
Let's slow down and unpack that because it sounds similar to Haeckel's idea, but I sense he's using it for the exact opposite conclusion. Let's start with ontogeny.
Ontogeny is simply the biological development of an individual organism over its lifespan. In this case, think of a human embryo growing in the womb from a fertilized egg to a newborn baby. Phylogeny, on the other hand, is the evolutionary history and development of a species over millions of years.
Okay, got it.
Abdu'L-Baha is directly comparing the vast evolutionary journey of humanity on planet Earth to the 9-month growth of a human embryo in the womb.
I find this analogy brilliant because it makes the abstract concept of essence visible. If you look at a photograph of a human embryo, when it is just a single fertilized cell or a cluster of cells, it looks absolutely nothing like a human being.
Not at all.
Weeks later, it develops what look like gill slits and a tail. Morphologically, it looks like a primitive worm or a fish. But here is the critical philosophical point he makes. It is never a worm. It is never a fish. From the absolute microsecond of conception, that cell possesses the complete human essence. Today, we have a scientific word for that. It has human DNA.
You've hit the nail on the head. The embryo's physical form is changing drastically. It is passing through primitive, unrecognizable stages. But its ultimate destination is securely locked in by its essence, its genetic blueprint.
Right.
In the exact same way, Abdu'L-Baha argues that the physical lineage of humanity started on this earth in the ancient oceans as a primitive, simple, single-celled organism. It evolved, it grew limbs, it changed shape through countless unrecognizable forms over millions of years. But from its very first physical manifestation in the mud, it was entirely guided by the human species' essence.
Meaning, it was never at any point biologically an animal essence that just got lucky and suffered a random mutation that bumped it up to human status.
Right. It was the human essence slowly developing its physical hardware over epochs, just as the embryo develops its organs over months, until the physical form was complex enough to manifest human consciousness.
So wait, this has huge implications for the fossil record. If a paleontologist walked up to Abdu'L-Baha and handed him a skull of what we call a missing link, say an Australopithecus or Homo habilis, he wouldn't look at it and say, ah, yes, this proves an ape mutated and became human.
No, he wouldn't.
He would say, no, that is simply an early, primitive developmental stage of the human essence, completely separate from the ape essence.
That is precisely how he framed it. In fact, he explicitly stated in his writings that the literal missing link between animal and man, a theoretical creature that is half ape essence and half human essence, will never be found in the dirt because they are on fundamentally distinct, parallel pathways.
Wow.
They might look incredibly similar in their primitive physical forms millions of years ago, just as a human embryo and a pig embryo look nearly identical under a microscope at 4 weeks. But their internal driving essences, their ultimate trajectories, are fundamentally distinct.
Which brings us to a massive collision between modern metabiology and Abdu'L-Baha's theology. This entire debate really boils down to the math of creation. How is complex functional order actually generated in the universe?
To address this, the authors of our source book, specifically von Kitzing, break down Abdu'L-Baha's logic into what they call the 3 causes of formation. The premise is simple. If you look at any highly complex functioning system, whether it's a living cell, the human eye, or a planetary ecosystem, that complexity must arise from one of 3 possible causes.
Let's try to logic our way through these. The first cause would have to be what the strict Darwinists are arguing for, right? Pure chance. Accidental formation.
Yes, cause number 1 is chance or accidental formation. Abdu'L-Baha examines this and excludes it based on the observable laws of chemistry and physics. In nature, random accidental combinations of elements usually lead to disintegration or inert clumps. Randomness doesn't spontaneously build highly functional, stable, self-replicating, interdependent systems.
Right.
To borrow your earlier imagery, a tornado blowing through a junkyard doesn't accidentally assemble a fully functioning Boeing 747. The math simply doesn't support it.
Okay, so if we rule out pure blind chance, what's next? Doesn't matter, just inherently want to form eyeballs, like it's built into the atoms themselves.
That brings us to cause number 2, necessary or inherent formation. This is the philosophical idea that complexity and life are an inherent, inseparable property of matter itself. Abdu'L-Baha excludes this using a very practical observation.
Which is?
If complexity in life were an inherent, unbreakable property of the atoms themselves, then things couldn't be broken down, diseased, or decomposed. If the atoms in a human body were inherently bound by necessity to be a human, you couldn't cremate a body and return it to scattered ash. The fact that living systems constantly break down proves the order is imposed upon the matter, not inherent to it.
Which leaves us with a single option. If it's not a random accident and it's not magically baked into the atoms themselves, it has to be cause number 3.
Voluntary or design formation. By a strict process of elimination, Abdu'L-Baha argues this is the only logical conclusion remaining. Complex, stable, goal-directed order must come from a unifying, unseen force imposing order on chaotic matter. It requires an intelligent design, a conscious will.
But surely modern science recoils at this. Bringing will or design into biology usually gets you laughed out of a university laboratory today. Does modern physics or biology echo this logic at all?
Surprisingly, there are profound echoes of this in rigorous modern thought. The text points out that William Hatcher, a respected mathematician, actually formulated a formal, peer-reviewed scientific proof of God based heavily on this exact logical sequence from Abdu'L-Baha regarding the causes of complex order.
Yeah.
Furthermore, prominent Nobel Prize-winning biologists like Jacques Monod have wrestled with this. Monod discussed the subtle but massive difference between creation, which implies the ad hoc, spontaneous emergence of order out of nowhere, and revelation, where biological evolution is viewed simply as the physical unfolding of an inherent, pre-existing order that was there all along.
The source material also brings up Richard Dawkins, which I found fascinating, because Dawkins is basically the modern high priest of the blind watchmaker theory. He wrote the book on the idea that evolution is totally blind, purposeless, and requires no designer.
The inclusion of Dawkins here is highly ironic and very revealing. To prove his thesis that random mutation combined with natural selection can generate complex order without a designer, Dawkins famously built computer models. In one well-known simulation, he created a program that would randomly generate letters, trying to eventually spell a specific phrase from Shakespeare. Methinks it is like a weasel.
If he just let the computer generate letters randomly, the universe would suffer heat death before it spelled that sentence by chance.
Exactly. Dawkins knew the math of pure chance was impossible. So, to make the program actually work and demonstrate evolution, he had to secretly program in what computer scientists call a fitness function. He gave the program a target goal. The code was written to compare the random gibberish to the target phrase, keep the letters that matched the goal, and discard the ones that didn't.
Wait a minute. So to mathematically prove that biological evolution doesn't need a designer or a goal, he had to consciously design a computer program and explicitly give it a goal.
That is the irony. In his attempt to prove a blind universe, Dawkins inadvertently proved Abdu'L-Baha's exact point. A guiding law, an essence, a fitness function, is mathematically and logically required to generate complex, specified order out of chaotic variables. Without the target phrase programmed in advance, the random letters remain gibberish forever.
Okay, this is philosophically tight, but let's drag it out of the realm of computer models and back into the dirt. If Abdu'L-Baha is right philosophically, if the blueprint, the essence, exists prior to the physical animal, what does that actually look like in the fossil record? How do these distinct essences manifest physically over billions of years?
The authors of the source material outline 2 potential biological models that are compatible with Abdu'L-Baha's philosophy. The first model is called parallel evolution.
How does that work?
Parallel evolution is the idea that distinct biological lines, or seeds, for each specific species' essence existed on Earth from the very beginning of the emergence of life.
So you're saying that 3.5 billion years ago, in some primordial soup, there was a single-celled organism being driven by the dog essence, and a completely different single-celled organism swimming next to it being driven by the human essence.
Yes. And here is the key to an observer with a microscope. Those 2 single cells might have looked absolutely morphologically identical. Their primitive DNA might have been nearly indistinguishable.
Wow.
But they contained different invisible potentials. Over millions of years, they evolved on parallel, independent tracks, slowly diverging in form as their distinct essences guided their physical development toward different ultimate goals.
Just like generic stem cells in a human embryo. At day 3, they all look identical, but some are secretly destined to become brain tissue, and others are destined to become heart muscle.
A perfect parallel. The second model the author suggests is called saltation, which translates to evolutionary jumps.
A jump, like a sudden mutation.
Sort of. Instead of having independent parallel lines existing since the dawn of time, saltation suggests that biological populations might have evolved collectively in a shared genetic pool. But when the physical environment was finally perfectly prepped, when the temperature, the atmosphere, the ecosystem reached a critical threshold, a portion of that population experienced a radical, sudden jump or macromutation.
And that jump wasn't random.
No, this jump wasn't random. It was the biological material suddenly aligning with a new, pre-existing, higher spiritual essence that it was finally complex enough to receive.
Like Avicenna's emanation. The hardware finally got good enough and a new software program suddenly downloaded into it. But honestly, whether we are talking about parallel tracks from the beginning of time or sudden jumping mutations, the core philosophical takeaway is exactly the same.
Yes, it is.
The blueprint must exist before the building is built. The physical environment, the predators, the climate doesn't invent the blueprint. It merely provides the raw materials and the necessary friction to build what was already planned.
That is an excellent synthesis of his position. The environment shapes the expression, but the essence dictates the reality.
So we've covered the biology, the philosophy, the Greeks, and the missing links, but we have to ask the ultimate so what question. Why does this highly technical, dense debate matter to you, the listener, trying to navigate the modern world? Why did Abdu'L-Baha, a religious leader focused on peace and unity, care so deeply about the mechanics of 19th century biology?
Because ideas have consequences, and Abdu'L-Baha saw the profound existential danger of what is called social Darwinism. He understood that how we define our origins dictates how we treat each other.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If human beings view themselves merely as the product of a blind, pitiless, indifferent universe, if we truly believe deep down that we are just highly evolved, hairless apes who got lucky in a brutal random lottery, then our society, our economics, and our politics will inevitably reflect that brutal belief.
If the absolute law of nature is survival of the fittest, and we are just nature, then the law of human society logically becomes might makes right.
Exactly. Abdu'L-Baha warned repeatedly in his travels that this materialistic view of origins provides the ultimate justification for humanity's worst impulses. It justifies aggressive war. It justifies violent colonization of the weak by the strong. It justifies extreme economic inequality.
Because if there's no purpose.
Right, because under strict materialism, if we are just animals competing for scarce resources on a floating rock, then crushing your weaker neighbor isn't evil, it's just biology acting according to its nature.
And historically, he was proven horrifyingly correct.
Yeah.
This exact philosophy was actively, explicitly used by European powers to justify the imperial land grabs in Africa and Asia, and it laid the ideological groundwork for the mechanized, industrialized slaughter of World War I.
It stripped away the sacredness of human life. But if we accept the teleological alternative Abdu'L-Baha presented, if evolution is goal-directed and purposeful, then human beings aren't a cosmic accident. We have a specific divine destiny.
And what does that destiny look like?
He taught that just as the physical human body evolved over millions of years through primitive, violent, animalistic forms to finally reach a state perfect enough to house human consciousness, human society is now undergoing its own evolution.
Oh, wow.
We are no longer evolving biologically in any significant way. We are now evolving socially and spiritually. And in this current higher stage of collective evolution, the laws of love, cooperation, altruism, and global unity are not just artificial, sentimental constructs invented by poets. They are the hard, natural, necessary laws of our spiritual evolution. If we fight them and revert to the law of the jungle, we perish. If we align with them, our civilization progresses.
That is an incredibly powerful paradigm shift. Looking back at the historical journey we've taken today, the 19th century intellectual crisis essentially trapped humanity in a false dichotomy. We were told by the fundamentalist that we had to choose a literal, magical 6,000-year creation story that ignored the rocks beneath our feet, or we were told by the materialists we had to accept a bleak, purposeless, random universe that ignored the yearning of our own consciousness. But Abdu'L-Baha stepped in and offered a robust, philosophically sound third way.
He bridged the gap. He affirmed that evolution is absolutely real, undeniable, and scientifically verifiable. But he redefined it not as a series of lucky accidents, but as the deliberate, temporal unfolding of eternal, pre-existing potentials.
The physical form of humanity evolved from the base elements of the earth, just like a fragile embryo grows in the dark womb of its mother. But it was always from the very first cell dividing in the ancient sea, guided by the essence of humanity. It was never blind lottery. The universe isn't a chaotic accident that just happened to get lucky.
It is a highly ordered matrix. It is essentially a cosmic womb designed intentionally to grow consciousness so that the universe can eventually look back, understand itself, and reflect upon its creator.
Which brings us full circle back to where we started on the sidewalk, looking up at the sky, the blueprint. We aren't debris swirling in a tornado. We are the skyscraper being built. And knowing there is a plan changes how we view every single interaction we have with each other and with our planet.
It demands a higher level of responsibility from us because we are the first creatures on Earth conscious enough to actually participate in our own ongoing evolution.
On that note, we want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. If Abdu'L-Baha's framework is right, and our physical biological evolution was meticulously guided by a predetermined species essence over millions of years, until it finally reached its current conscious state, what is the predetermined blueprint for our social and cultural evolution? If our physical bodies have finished evolving, what unseen eternal essence is human civilization currently mutating, fighting, and struggling to become? Think about that the next time you look at the news or engage in a debate. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today.